I couldn't help thinking as we were listening to the candles of prayers and concerns how both our joys and our sorrows can get us a little off balance, take us out of our center. I'm especially thinking of Jennifer and Stefan right now and the journey that they are on together. So I would like to, if I may, with your consent, read a blessing for equilibrium. And I'm reading from, it's a little book we've used before in this congregation. It's called To Bless the Space Between Us by John O'Donohue. For equilibrium. Like the joy of the sea coming home to shore, may the relief of laughter rinse through your soul. As the wind loves to call things to dance, may your gravity be lightened by grace. Like the moon night restoring the earth, may your thoughts incline with reverence and respect. As water takes whatever shape it is in, so free may you be about who you become. As silence smiles on the other side of what's said, may your sense of irony bring perspective. As time remains free of all that it frames, may your mind stay clear of all it names. May your prayer of listening deepen enough to hear in the depths the laughter of God. May it be so. Our reading this morning is very brief. It's the first 4 verses from Psalm 119. And I loved what was said, Peter, before you said about the connection with the earth and nature. Psalm 119. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. I love the bit of paradox in these words from the Psalms as they witness to the grandeur of the way the heavens communicate about the glory of the source of all creation. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night declares knowledge. As though each day and each night communicates to the next the wisdom that will unfold from the rising of the setting to the setting of the sun, and then through the darkness that embraces creation until the next rising. And then there's that little bit of paradox. There is no speech. There are no words. Their voice is not heard. Yet, their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Meditating on this psalm this week led me to all kinds of thinking about listening and hearing as spiritual functions, maybe spiritual disciplines or practices that might serve to ground us well in the swirl of all the auditory stimuli that bombard us every day. I was drifting off to sleep the other night when I realized that I can easily block out visual stimuli. I can just close my eyelids or use an eye mask, and there's instant restful darkness. But tuning out what comes into my ears is much more difficult. My ears are open. There are no earlids. Even earplugs don't keep out all the sound. And trying to sleep with sound-deadening earphones doesn't work very well either. They're uncomfortable, but there's still the vibration of sound that gets through, even if we're not really hearing it. The ability to hear and its accompanying difficulty in reducing auditory input are both really primitive survival functions. We need to be able to hear. Our ancestors needed to be acutely aware of the sounds around them that might warn them of impending danger that they might not necessarily detect so quickly with their eyes. So hearing is kind of a built-in early warning system. It's the sense by which sound is perceived, allows us to distinguish between sounds. It's a special sense that allows us to connect with our surroundings in ways that allow us to orient ourselves to the environment. And if you're like me and you're experiencing any diminishment of your hearing, you can probably relate to how disorienting it can be, missing important auditory information, trying to fill in the blanks when you don't hear the last syllable in that word that's being spoken. But listening is something else again. Listening is what we do when we pay attention to the sounds that we hear. It involves being somehow related to whatever it is that the sound represents. Listening is what enables us to tune in to others. And it's how we know we are part of the various worlds around us, the world of nature, the world of technology, the media world. But for this morning, I just want us to think together a little bit about listening as a spiritual art and a practice, maybe as a discipline. In Jewish practice, perhaps the most central prayer is one that's recited twice each day. It sounds like this. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It's a command. Shema means listen. And it's followed by a really radical theological statement. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Rabbi Art Green, in his book titled These Are the Words, teaches that the Shema is referred to as the proclamation of divine oneness. There's no profane or secular realm where the divine presence cannot be found. Divine oneness includes and embraces all. Everything exists within the divine. Rabbi Green goes on to cite Rabbi Judah Leib Alter, that's a mouthful. He lived from 1847 to 1904, and this rabbi affirmed that there is no other being than the one. This is true even though it seems otherwise to most of us. Everything that exists in the world, spiritual and physical, is the one itself. It takes a lifetime to get one's head around this notion. Martin Buber, one of the greatest Jewish teachers of the 20th century, affirmed that the world is lit by eternity. It is lit from within. Quaker tradition affirms that we all carry the divine spark. Perhaps the greatest challenge of really listening deeply is being able to reverence that truth, even when we encounter the most repugnant aspects of humanity. Deep listening challenges us to recognize that even in the worst of us, the divine spark flickers. In essence, the Shema affirms oneness, that all is a manifestation of one holiness. There's no separation. It's an affirmation that when we look on another human being, when we enjoy a Menemsha sunset, when we hear the cry of a newborn, when we witness the tragedy of war and the ugliness of politics. We are witnessing one, holiness. So as I said, the prayer is an extremely radical theological statement about the oneness of all, and it begins with the call to listen. Listening involves paying attention, being present. It involves holding a spacious hospitality, and most particularly, listening is an act of compassion. Listening is an essential part of the discernment process, whereby we're able to discern and identify what are the divine messages that are being communicated to us in our many, many connections throughout the world around us. Listening is what enables us to tune in to others and to our own voices of intuition and conscience. Deep listening offers the opportunity to experience the divine presence and helps us to keep from objectifying the other with whom it is difficult to tolerate. If I'm not willing to listen, I will never hear what the divine oneness will teach me. But listening, truly deep listening, is a challenge. I took the title of Kay Lindahl's book, The Sacred Art of Listening, for the sermon title today because she so clearly identifies deep listening as a spiritual practice. She writes, "There's something beyond technique when two or more people are deeply listening to one another. It's an awareness that not only are we present to each other, we are present to something that is spiritual, holy, sacred," close quote. Kay Lindahl says this kind of listening really goes against the cultural grain. This astounded me. The average attention span for adults is about 22 seconds. Immediately after listening to someone talk, we usually recall only about half of what we've heard. Within a few hours, only 20%. And that we may not recall accurately. So, deep listening is accurately called a spiritual practice, with the emphasis on the word practice. And it is in small communities where people are committed to one another through shared values and for their caring for each other's well-being that the practice of deep listening can be cultivated. Listening deeply to one another is challenging because it requires being comfortable with silence, with keeping our own silence on behalf of the other person, withholding our own stories, and allowing space for the other to give voice to what they need to speak. Nell Morton was one of the early feminist theologians who taught at Drew University. And she wrote a book called The Journey is Home. And in it, she tells of her story of her experience with women's circles during the turbulent 70s and continuing on into the 80s. Some of the women here may have had the experience of those kinds of gatherings. And she tells the story of how in one circle, a woman began to tell her story of her life of feeling repressed and suppressed as a woman. It was a painful sharing. And she was talking, and then someone else in the circle said, "Oh, do I identify with that?" And she began telling her story, thus effectively silencing the first woman. In another of these circles, another woman began to tell her story. And she was awkward as she began to speak. She said, I hurt all over. And she touched herself as if trying to locate where the pain was. She said, I hurt all over, but I don't know where to begin to cry. She talked on and on and on, and she finally reached a point of excruciating pain. And no one moved. No one interrupted. Finally, she finished. And after a period of silence, she looked around at each woman in turn in the circle. And then she said slowly, "You listened. You heard me all the way. I have a strange feeling you heard me before I ever started. You heard me to my own story." When we're willing to cultivate the practice of deep listening, with all the restraint and all the discomfort with our own silence that requires, we're doing a sacred spiritual work of listening and hearing another person into speech. I could not help thinking how desperately deficient we are right now as a culture in our ability to listen to the voices that disturb us, the voices that offend our sensibility with their lack of rationality. The deep, receptive silence required for deep listening is so uncomfortable that we are limited in our ability to hear the profound sorrow, the shame, the fear, and yes, the anger and the rage, without immediately formulating our own responses and our own defenses. We do not hear because it's so painful to listen. Deep listening is a concept that's found in all religious traditions. About 31 years ago, just before Armin and I made the decision to locate here permanently, we had the opportunity to spend 3 weeks in China. No matter where we went, I was impressed by the presence of shrines to Kuan Yin, the bodhisattva of compassion. And we saw these little shrines set up in corners, in business places, in hotel lobbies, in grubby back rooms, in manufacturing places. We saw them at roadside shrines. And all this in a country where religion had been seriously suppressed. Perhaps the single most impressive image that I saw was a 30-foot-high statue of Kuan Yin painted in bright, garish colors, overlooking the harbor in Hong Kong, as though it were keeping watch over the hundreds of houseboats that were floating there. In her divine manifestation and her feminine manifestation, Kuan Yin is known as she who hears the cries of the world. Her compassion is predicated on her listening to the pain of humankind. For millions of souls in a culture religiously repressed for years, the embrace of a listening bodhisattva, the bodhisattva of compassion, meant hope and healing. A small faith community is a most perfect place for practicing the art of deep listening. A community where some bonds of trust are already in place, where caring for one another already exists. Each time I see in the UU newsletter the invitation to let's have a visit, I see the potential for the practice of listening. Not very many small congregations have a lay pastoral care team in place, but one exists here, folks who are willing to practice the art of listening. Deep listening is called a spiritual practice, as I said, for exactly the reason that it requires practice. Just as any other art discipline requires practice, it doesn't come naturally to us. But what better place to practice than to practice here together? What better place to discover the deep wells of compassion that reside here collectively and in each one of us as individuals? Listening is an art, and it's a spiritual gift to the world. When we practice the spiritual art of deep listening, enduring the discomfort that comes with holding our own silence and remaining open in compassion to the story of another, we each contribute in our own way to what Jewish tradition calls tikkun olam, the healing of the world. Shema, Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. We are radically one with all that is holy. Listening deeply to one another and to the world around us is the entry point into a fuller consciousness of the oneness of all being. May we be blessed with ears to hear. Amen.